Talk about typography. Okay, so we'll start with fonts. Now, fonts is a commonly misused term. What we usually call a font is actually a typeface. So, like Helvetica would be a typeface, Helvetica Bold would be a font within that typeface. But they're commonly misused. Very, very few people know the difference. Quite frankly, I always mix up the words that I'm using. So it's not important, but just for, just to be technical, Helvetica would be a typeface. Bold would be a font within the typeface. And fonts can also be called weights. So a weight would be, bold, italic, things like that. Now the characters within a font are called glyphs. Okay? And glyphs would be everything you would expect: letters, numbers, ampersands, symbols such as that. But certain fonts will go a bit further and add mathematical equations, fractions, things like that. So a lot of times the better a font is, the higher quality it is, the more glyphs it will include. Okay? And glyphs do include bold and italic. So if you're in like Microsoft Word and you click B to make a word bold, all you're doing really is just taking that font face, and making it a bit heavier. Or in italic, all you're basically doing is slanting it. But true bold and italic typefaces are different. The characters are drawn differently. It's not just a slanted letter in italics. It's a letter that is actually a drawn italic letter. Okay. So these fonts are created by companies called foundries. And a foundry can be, a large company, even as large as Adobe, or it can be a single person who designs these fonts. And it just depends on, how well a job they do as to how the quality of that font. A higher quality font will have more glyphs and some other features that we'll cover later. Now you'll see here a font face like Roboto has a lot of options. Some fonts are very simple. It'll just be bold, italic, and regular. Or some of them will have thins, italics, lights, mediums, bold, blacks. You can have several different weights. Okay, so a better font will have more weights associated with it. Now here you'll see the difference between a serif font and a sans serif font. Okay, now sans serif fonts go back to the time of basically stone carvers. They would they would carve these small little, decorations, I guess you would call it, into the ends of the letters just to make their art more valuable. Okay. So you would have a sans serif font. So a sans serif font would have none of that. It's just your basic, very technological, very geometric shapes as you see down there. Okay. So the serif font lends itself more towards older, more elegant designs. But what it does also do is it makes the font more readable at a smaller size. Okay, we'll see a demonstration of that in a moment. So if you're setting large blocks of copy, then I would probably set it in a serif font just to aid in readability. As long as the serif font doesn't totally blow out any kind of design aesthetic you have that would require a very, very clean, geometric, technical looking design, where you might want that sans serif font in there. Okay. So you'll see here in this three-lined paragraph, when it's set correctly in a sans serif font, in a serif font, you can see how it doesn't really matter what order the letters are in. Your eye still puts together the shape of the word, and that those serifs actually help this happen. Okay, and then you'll see down there with some of the font names that you might see listed in a drop-down menu for a font in the computer. Roman fonts are serif, and Gothic fonts are sans serif. Now, Roman and Gothic are certainly falling by the wayside. I don't see them near as much as I used to, but that would be like kind of the code name as to whether you were going to choose a serif or a sans serif font based on whether it was a Roman or a Gothic. Okay. So now there is ideal line lengths. Okay. How long or how wide should a block of copy be before you would make it narrower or set it to 2 columns or something like that? And that is typically between 1.5 and 2 times the length of the alphabet that font is set in. Okay. If it's any longer, then what happens when the reader is reading it, they get to the end of the line and their eye moves back to the left side again, they might miss a line or read the same line again. So what we want to do is we want to keep that line length short enough that their eye drops down to the next correct line when they're reading. Okay? So if you're setting copy and you get to the point where your line length is getting too long, you want to consider creating a 2-column or 3-column layout. Okay? So when we talk about font sizes, point size, okay, they are very relative to within that typeface. Okay, so 12-point type in one font can look very different than 12-point type in another font. Okay, so see here there are 3 fonts. All of them are technically the same font size, same point size, but you can tell by the design of the letters, design of the glyphs, that they are very different looking in how and what size they are. Okay. So when we talk about parts of the letter, and I will go over some of this, like when we're talking about your designs, and I say something like your ascenders getting too close to your descenders, or something like that. This will be kind of what we're talking about. Okay, so you can see we've got the different things. We've got ascenders, okay, which would be like the top of the H here. Okay, descender, anything that drops below the baseline. Okay, those are important. X height is important. Okay, X height is basically the height of the lowercase letters. Okay, so the smaller the X height compared to the overall height of the font, the harder it will be to read. So you can see up here, in this type, the X height is very close to the top of the letters. Makes it a very reasonable font. Down here, the X height is much smaller, and therefore makes that a more difficult font to read. Okay. So we've got our X height, ascenders, descenders. So those are a lot of things we'll talk about. And then you'll see here's an example of italics, where this F is not just a regular F that's been slanted. That is a specific letter F for an italic typeface. Okay. And then we're going to talk about kerning. They call this kerning or tracking. Okay. And that is the space between letters. Okay. Now, a font is a lot more than just the glyphs. Okay. They also have what's called a kerning pair. Okay. So in a well-designed font, there is a set kerning pair, a set space between every 2 letters. Okay. So there's going to be a kerning space that's set between an A and an A, another kerning space that's set between an A and a B, another between an A and a C, etc., for every possible combination. So you can see how a lot of work can go into this. Okay. That's in a really well done, professionally designed font. A lot of fonts will just do the more common ones, maybe just between the letters. And an example of that is oftentimes how bad kerning pairs are when we're dealing with numbers. And others won't do any and will just let the computer estimate and handle it. Okay. So we will talk about kerning, and there may be times where I will say to you, check the kerning or the tracking between a given set of characters in your designs. Okay. So now a ligature. Okay. Like we saw up at the front with this particular block here, this FI is actually one character. Okay. So some fonts have things called ligatures. They are characters where you'll see here the F and the I are combined versus just smashed together where the dot in the I gets too close to the F. Okay. Most fonts have the ligatures designed in and will automatically fill them in. You don't have to type a special character. You don't have to search for it anywhere. It will be handled all by itself. Okay. And then we've got monospaced fonts. Okay. Monospaced fonts are set up so that every character is the same width. Okay. So obviously there's got to be a little bit of design trickery in there to get the lowercase m and the lowercase I to be the same width. And you'll notice here that the lowercase m is a sans serif character and the lowercase I is a serifed character. So in this particular font, they actually mix the 2 together just so that they have something to work with so that they can get all these letters to the same width. These are best used when we're doing type set in columns or things where it was really important that everything line up properly. But other than that, I wouldn't use a monospaced font for setting blocks of text because it gets a little bit more difficult to read than the other traditionally designed fonts. Okay. And then we'll talk about case. Okay. So you've got all uppercase, okay? Obviously most often used in things like headlines. Okay. Lowercase, which is strictly all lowercase. Title case is when the first letter in every word is capitalized. And in sentence case is, self-explanatory. As you would read a regular sentence, that's the proper capitalization scheme. Okay. So sometimes we might change the case. I'll say this is set in title case, it should be set in sentence case, or vice versa. Okay. Now, when we start to get into real professional typesetting, small caps are a thing. Okay. So you'll see here, every time I have an acronym, an AEMT, CPR, EMS, it's just set in capital letters. Okay. In a well-designed font, there's going to be an entire set of glyphs that are what's called small caps. Okay. So in traditional professional typesetting, you would set an acronym that's all capital letters in small caps. And you would see that it does become easier to read in a block of text because you don't have these giant acronyms sticking out at you that are set in all full-size capital letters. Okay. So you can set things in small caps. Okay. Now, the ink colors in small fonts. We dealt with some of this in the first class, and some of you ran into this problem a little bit with your business cards. Okay. If you set a font in a color that consists of multiple inks, and we talked about inks in the first class, the CMYK, okay, then if it's slightly out of register, then it will appear slightly blurry. So you'll see in the first word first, it's a blue that is made up of at least 3 colors, 3 CMYK inks. Okay? And then in the middle example, when those inks are just slightly offset, you get just that little bit of a blur to it. And then on the right, if we set it just in black, it'll stay nice and crisp. This also works in the reverse, which is what some of you ran into with your business cards, where you try to put white text on a multicolored background. So same thing, just in reverse. The background now has 2, 3, or 4 colors in it that when they're offset will make the white of the font appear like it is slightly blurry. So if you're going to set a font in a small point size, try and make it just black, or at the very least a 2-color ink, maybe just cyan and magenta or something like that. Okay. And then same thing when you're reversing it out, if you're going to put small white copy on a colored background, make sure that colored background only has 1 or 2 or possibly 3 max ink colors in it. I would try and stick with just 2. Okay. Then we have something called typographic color. Okay. That's a combination of the font face, okay, and how open it is, its X height, again, adding to that readability. How large is the X height compared to the overall height of the font? How closely tracked or kerned together is it? You'll see that the topmost example has more space between the letters than the next one, the bolder one. Is it a bold font? Is it a very boldly designed font? Okay. And then you'll see we could use these for different examples. Okay. Which one would you use for a wedding invitation? Which one would you use for the body copy of an annual report? Which one would you use to set for if you were setting an entire page like a book page, which font would you use? So each font has different meanings, different weights, different colors, and they all add to readability, to the design aesthetic. It just depends on how you want to set it. So you'd set it with a little more space between the letters, or set it with a little more space between the lines, which is called leading. We'll talk about that in a second. And also, when you're changing font sizes and leading and the space between the lines, that also helps you manage the space. If you have a page to put the copy in, and you have a page and 3 lines worth of copy, then tweaking just one of these things, maybe just tweaking the tracking a little bit, a little less space between each letter, might make the copy shrink up and get those 2 or 3 extra lines back on that one page. So you can actually use font size, tracking, and things like that to manage the block of text itself. Okay? So now we'll talk about leading. Leading is the space between the lines. Typically, the default is 120% of the point size. Okay? So if you're going to set 10-point copy, you would set it with 12-point leading. Leading comes back from the days of actually setting blocks of copy for the old school offset printers. Okay? And you would put actually little strips of lead between the lines of letters. Okay? So between your lines and your sentences, you would put a 1-point piece of lead or a 3-point piece of lead, and that was called a leading. Okay? So leading can be used, again, to manage space, to aid in readability. Okay? A little more leading between lines makes it a little easier to read large blocks of copy, but you don't want the amount of leading you would use in a block of copy in a headline. In a headline, it would be too much. Okay? It would be too much space between. So you can set the leading. Let's say if you're setting a headline in 72-point type, you might be able to set the leading at 72-point, or sometimes even less. You might even be able to set that leading at 68-point for a 72-point font in a headline. Okay. And now we'll talk about the tracking and kerning. Okay. So like I say, when they would type these in, they would add a kerning pair between the Y and the 1, between the H and the Y. That's all added by the font itself, by the designer of the font. Okay? But they're not always great. A lot of times you will get a lot of space around the number 1. That's probably the biggest, most common problem, is the tracking around numbers, and especially the number 1. But also around punctuation a lot of times. Okay? So this is the way an apostrophe S would be set if I just typed it in. Okay? But if I were setting this in a line of text or a headline, I would actually tweak these together a little bit. Okay? Like so. And you can see a lot of times you can increase or decrease the tracking between 2 letters or between an entire word. The way to adjust that is different depending on the software program you're in. So you just have to take a look whether you're in Word or Canva or InDesign, to figure out how to reduce your tracking and leading between different letters and between lines of copy. Okay. So the next thing that we have, again getting into the more professional type setting, is the difference between hyphens and en dashes and em dashes. Okay. Each one is specific. A lot of them have a specific keystroke combination, depending on whether you're on a PC or a Mac, depending on whether you're in Word or InDesign. But each one has a different meaning. So a hyphen joins words. Okay, dog-friendly, eco-friendly, things like that. Okay? An en dash covers a span of time. Okay, 1998 through 2021. Yesterday afternoon dash tomorrow afternoon, however you want to set it up so that the en dash covers the span of time, and then an em dash covers indicates a pause in thought. Okay, so the em dash is slightly wider. It's supposed to be the width of the lowercase m in that particular font. Okay, so hyphen links 2 words together, en dash span of time, em dash a pause. Okay. And now we've got feet and inch marks. Okay. Those are actually different. They are not quotes. They're actually called primes and double primes. Again, characters that are called glyphs designed by the font. Some fonts just do not have them. All they have is the quote marks, and if you're setting your copy in that font, then you just have to use the quote marks. But most of the time, a higher quality font will have the prime marks so that you can set it in the feet and inch marks. Okay. And then we have to remember also superscript and subscript. Okay, if you were setting January 23rd, you would set this up as such. Okay. The RD for the 23rd would be superscript. Okay, so now when we look at H2O, the 2 would be a subscript. But you can see it looks a little low, right? We want to be able to set copy professionally and not just give or take what the computer gives to us, okay? So in some of the more advanced programs like Adobe InDesign, we might be able to bump the baseline shift up a little bit to get a slightly more professional looking chemical symbol here. And we can even increase the point size if we would like as well. Okay? We can set it up so that it looks the way that we want it to look and not necessarily just take what the computer gives us. Okay? We can adjust baseline tracking up, baseline shift up and down, point size up and down to get something that looks the way we want it to look. Now, like I said, I wouldn't do this in an entire block of copy, but if this were a headline or a graphic symbol, part of an icon, part of a logo, then I would do some tweaking like this. Okay? Fractions are the same way. This might be how you would type 4 1/4, and that's the way the computer would give it to you. Okay, and then you could cheat and make one of these superscript, one of them subscript. See, we're still not quite where we want to be. We could tweak this over a little bit, right? We could baseline shift it up, right, to build one, okay, a little better. Or maybe there is a glyph. Maybe this font foundry has developed an actual 1/4 symbol. So now there is a 1/4 symbol that has been created. It's a single character. Okay. And that would be how we would set 4 1/4, okay, by using the glyph of the 1/4 instead of doing all that tweaking. But you can do all the tweaking if you have to, if you don't have a glyph, or if it's an odd fraction, 15/17, you might have to be making that one yourself. All right. So now we'll talk a little bit more about setting large blocks of copy. Okay, we've got something here. If you remember, if you were taught traditional typewriter copy setting, at the end of a sentence you would type 2 spaces. Okay, that is just for typewriters, and particularly monospaced fonts within typewriters. In the traditional, in the digital realm with designed fonts such as these, you do not need the 2 spaces at the end of a sentence. 1 is fine. Okay? But the other thing we don't do now, I'm going to turn on invisible so that you can see the paragraph returns. Okay? If I needed to put a second paragraph in here, okay, most people would hit return again to get our paragraph space. Okay, that's what we would look like. But that's not how it's done anymore. Okay, in a traditional type setting, what I would do is hit my return, give myself a second paragraph here, and then I would increase the space before, okay, of that paragraph. Okay. So that would be how it's done professionally. Now, what this allows us to do, let's say that I have 6 pages, all full of paragraphs like this with that 0.125 space before, and I need just a little more space. I have about another paragraph or 2 left over that don't fit on those pages. Well, I can take all of those paragraphs and decrease their space before to 0.12. And now there's a little bit less space between each paragraph. The copy then becomes a little bit more compact, and I can get that last line or 2 or paragraph or 2 of copy onto that page. Okay, and this is one of the settings that can be set up in a style sheet. We will handle style sheets later in the course, but I can set a paragraph style sheet to 0.125, and then I can take that paragraph style sheet and change it to 0.12, and every paragraph in the document will now go to 0.12. So that way I can maintain my consistency. All of my paragraphs will look the same all the time, and I can manage and tweak and manipulate the spacing so that I can make text fit in a given amount of space by decreasing and increasing these numbers. Okay. Justification is something I'm sure that you're all familiar with. Okay. left justified, center justified, right justified, and then justified or forced justification would be the one on the right. Okay. That you'll see most often in things like newspapers. Okay. The issue with that, there are two, is one, you have less control over your hyphenation. If you look at all of the words in that paragraph on the right, how many of them are hyphenated? Okay, so you're going to get a lot of hyphenation, and you also get a lot of large spaces between words, like this line right here. Okay, the narrower that column gets, the more of this kind of a problem you're going to get, where it's trying to force letters, force words onto lines, and you're going to get these large spaces. Okay, so I would say I would use this sparingly, only if you really have to, and definitely with columns that are slightly wider than this one would be. Okay. Now, a few more things. These are kind of tucked on at the end. I have nowhere else really to stick them. In your readings, you're going to be reading about different font combinations. And it is perfectly acceptable to find a font combination that you like, one that you use for headlines, one that you use for body copy. Okay. And remember those fonts. Remember the name of them. They work well for you. There's no reason in the world why you can't take those with you. I have used a font combination in my last 3 full-time jobs because it works. If I have to set a document in my new job, I just go and grab one of the documents from my old job, save as, and start working. I have all of my style sheets built. I have all of my fonts selected. I know everything works well. They're great font collections, lots of glyphs, things, all the characters that I need. And that just travels with me. It's my combination, and I like it. So if you have the ability to do that, if you're not being forced into a existing style guide or something like that, take this font combination with you. It works for you. You're familiar with it, and you can use it all over the place. Okay. So now we'll look at phone numbers real quick. There are many ways to set phone numbers now. Okay. This is one that I think is now out of date. Okay. It puts the area code in the parentheses. Now, there was a time when just that 7-digit phone number was the only phone number that I had. A 7-digit phone number would call the house, okay, my home. Okay. That's not the case anymore. Everybody has these 10-digit phone numbers. But the area code really is not such an important thing anymore. And specifically with mobile, doesn't really matter because you can get a phone in Minnesota, live in Philadelphia, your area code doesn't really indicate where you are anymore anyway. So I really think that the parentheses is now an out-of-date thing. So you can set it with just hyphens. You can set it with the more stylish dots now, whichever your style might dictate or whichever one you might be required to do. As you'll see here, we were talking about tracking earlier and how much of a mess it is with numbers. You can see the difference in spacing between the 6, the 1, and the 0, between the 1 and the 2. The 1, like I said, is always a problem. So if I were to set this in something maybe like a poster, I would tweak the numbers, tweak the kerning between the numbers so that it looks a little more consistent. Websites are another thing. Is the www required anymore? Okay. Some people say yes, because when you're looking at a block of copy, it will help you find and point out the website right away. I say either. At this point in time, it does not really matter whether you include it or not. And again, whether you want it to have capitals, whichever you'd like, I think it does not matter, except that once you choose it, stick with it. If you stick with an all lowercase URL that has the www in front of it, make sure that every website in your document appears in that same format. Okay? Now this has to do specifically with setting copy that is decorative or advertising, things like that. This is not adhering to any style guide, citations, things like that. Those obviously have very, very specific rules, and you would want to follow those. And then the last two things that we'll talk about are copyright and trademark symbols. Okay, so let's say with Starbucks, I got to put the registration mark on there. Okay, and there it is. Boom, that's the one that I get just by typing it. Okay, obviously way too large, so you could superscript it. And quite frankly, I think that's too large. Okay. There is nothing that dictates really the size that these need to be, okay, as long as they are there. Okay. So I might set it like that professionally. Okay. That way it's there, it's legally required to be there, but it does not have to be as big as the font gives it to you. And then same thing with your TM symbol. Okay. You can drop the point size way down on that and bump it up. Okay. And then decrease tracking a little bit. And that's how I would set the trademark symbol for that. Okay. So again, you don't always have to take exactly what the computer gives you. Look at your font as you set it. Look at your kerning. Look at your spacing. Look at your superscripts, your subscripts, and tweak them where you can.